So Corey Lester is our speaker today. He is a research assistant professor of clinical pharmacy at the University of Michigan College of Pharmacy. He graduated with his PharmD from the University of Rhode Island in 2012, completed a PGY1 community practice residency at Virginia Commonwealth University in 2013, received his MS PhD in pharmacy administration from the University of Wisconsin-Madison in 2017. And his research focuses on identifying and solving challenges associated with medication use, including the prevention of errors, optimizing pharmacist work, and improving drug therapy for patients. You guys help me in welcoming him.
Thank you so much for having me. I met Amy one of the first weeks that I was here, and then she asked me to give this talk. This, of course, is a picture of the Golden Gate Bridge. My background is a little bit unique in that in grad school, the majority of my coursework was actually in the College of Engineering at Wisconsin. So taking courses in human factors, job design, and then machine learning and data analytics. And so I like to think of myself as somewhat of a bridge between the two communities, right? The industrial engineering community and the clinician or pharmacy community. And I feel like I can speak both languages pretty well. Obviously I'm not practicing 24/7, so if you don't use it, you lose it. So some of the drug knowledge starts to fade a little bit, but for the most part, yeah, I like to think of myself somewhere in between and can help bring the two groups together. So today I'm going to talk about, we'll just go over some very high level, the current landscape of pharmacy practice and medication use in the US and around the world. Introduce some of the human factors and cognitive engineering models and provide specific examples of research that I've done in this area. And I know we have sort of a mix of a group, so I don't want to, going to try and talk to all audiences. And then talk a little bit about some of the current work that I'm doing as well as future research focused on how do we support pharmacist work and improve medication safety. So here on your left-hand side is from the Kaiser Family Foundation. So total healthcare spending in 2022 is projected to be $5.1 trillion, and with the prescription drugs making up about almost 10% of the total healthcare spending. So in relation to the full all of healthcare spending, prescription drugs, not that large of a component. Obviously, hospital care and physician services make up a much larger proportion. However, what we're seeing is as more generic drugs enter the market, the cost per drug has gone down, except for what we call specialty pharmaceuticals. So these are very highly expensive medications designed to treat very small, specific populations. So like hepatitis C, the new drugs to treat those are an example of specialty medications, cost tens of thousands of dollars in treatment, but have a very high rate of curing hep C. On the right-hand side, we have sort of a plot that I've seen over and over and over again. I don't know if some of you guys may have seen it as well. But the US spends by far the most dollars per capita on healthcare spending, yet we achieve mediocre at best life expectancy, right? And so part of that can be attributed to the healthcare system, but we're also finding more and more that it's the social determinants of health. So education, socioeconomic status, those factors also heavily influence life expectancy as well. All right, so pharmacy in particular, so the community pharmacy or the retail pharmacy space is in a bit of flux. So every once in a while, the margins on prescription drugs decrease. So the large chains have about a 30% margin. They buy a drug for 30% less than they make off of it, and that is the primary source of where pharmacist salaries come from, is that margin between what it's purchased for and what it's sold for. And then pharmacists provide care associated with that drug product in the pharmacies. CVS has since or recently acquired Aetna, which is a full health insurer. They also have their own pharmacy benefits manager. So the pharmacy benefit managers handle just the prescription drug claims for employer groups or the health insurers themselves. So, and then they also have minute clinics as well, so that now they have a variety of healthcare practitioners as well as insurer groups. Walgreens has purchased Rite Aid. They were able to purchase some of the stores, not all of them, due to conflicts of interest. And then big in the news was Amazon purchasing a company called PillPack out of Boston. And this was a small mail order pharmacy, but really Amazon's first step into the prescription drug fulfillment business. So medication safety has taken on greater emphasis over the years, ever since the IOM report to err is human in 2000. The World Health Organization recently made it its third priority for addressing the health of populations around the globe. They estimate that it can be attributed to $42 billion in annual treatment costs. And in the US, we see about 700,000 ED visits annually and about 100,000 hospitalizations each year as a direct result of a medication error. Unfortunately, progress has been really painstakingly slow. So the ability to really move the needle on decreasing error rates has been difficult, and not just all errors, but also the ones that are causing the most severe harm. So I don't know if you guys saw this on the right hand side. In 2014, a scientific committee was charged with reporting to then President Obama about how to improve healthcare at lower costs, and they came away with the primary conclusion that systems engineering was the way to go about it. So you guys are like hitting it at a good time, and more, there's more and more recognition that the skills that you guys have are incredibly valuable and can really move the needle on quality, costs, and outcomes. And this is, on the left-hand side, is from the Institute for Healthcare Improvement. And they define this quadruple aim. So better outcomes in terms of quality and safety. They talk about the patient experience being a relevant component. It's been, in some studies have been shown, better patient experience has better outcomes. Lower costs. Healthcare makes up almost 20% of our GDP, and that everyone's saying that that's not sustainable, and it continues to grow. And then the fourth part, which initially was left out of the triple aim, was provider well-being. It's something that I'm particularly interested in. I think that often we forget about, we get focused on patients, and patients are, as a clinician, what we're, who we're trying to help. But if we have unhealthy, burnt out providers, then we can't translate that into high quality patient care. And so I think these are two key components of how we should focus our efforts. So I want to talk about pharmacy as a work system, right? So pharmacy as a work system, right? If we were to think about Donna Bedian's structure, process, outcomes model, if we were to open up that black box of what the structure is, we would see these component parts, right? So it's a human or humans interacting with a technical environment, and so if we look here, this model is called the SEEPS model. And if we look at the first part, that's how we could define some of the components of a work system. And it's really, the focus is on the interactions between each of those 5 buckets, right? So I as a pharmacist are using technology, and that's influencing how I'm accomplishing different tasks. The schedule that my employer gives me influences how well I do those tasks, potentially, positive or negative. And so we can think about the process of dispensing medications or drug therapy, or making decisions about drug therapy, as sort of this overarching process. And those components of the work system influence how that process is carried out. And that process there in turn reflects the types of outcomes that we get, both positive and negative. And so these can be patient-related outcomes, so quality of care, patient safety, but also employee and organizational outcomes, so provider well-being, the sustainability of the organization, and then those processes there feed back into the work system, and we make changes and adaptations to the system to improve the quality of care. So, who has done like observations in a pharmacy or been behind the pharmacy walls? A couple of people. So everyone that I know that has gone behind the bench is always usually kind of blown away at like what's actually going on. It tends to be much more. Can be hectic, chaotic environment. That you can have one pharmacist and 2, maybe 3 technicians doing anywhere from 200 to 400 prescriptions in like a 10-hour day. And so if we think about what happens, the physician or prescriber in the clinic or hospital sends an e-prescription over to the pharmacy receives it in their own dispensing software via a company, or often a company called SureScripts, who relays the information from the electronic health record into the dispensing software. People are also surprised when I tell them the pharmacy does not have access to the electronic health record. We know nothing about, we only know what you have told us or what we have gathered from a physician or provider over the phone. Or what's contained on that prescription. So sometimes we get like a little note that explains what it's for. We often, hate to say this, and I'll show you later, but we sometimes don't even know what the medication we're dispensing is being used to treat until we ask you. So if a medication has multiple indications or reasons that it could be treating, we are relying on our own expert judgment based on someone's age, their gender, what the medication might be being used for, and then not until the patient comes in can we know for sure. Yeah.
Sorry, could you explain why that is? That just like HIPAA, or is it the expectation that you've spoken to a pharmacist at your clinical encounter?
Why we don't have
Yeah.
access to the EHR? I think there's several reasons. I think the big one is the lack of interoperability between the two systems. And if pharmacists are always saying we want access to the health record, but it's never really resolved who's going to pay for that access. And if we have access, I'd like to know, how do pharmacists use it to inform their decision making? But it is multifactorial. Yeah.
Is this primarily at community pharmacies, or is this also at the hospital systems?
Yeah, so this is primarily community pharmacies not connected to the health system. So in the hospital, yes, you have access to the health record, patient charts, labs, all of that. And then pharmacies at Michigan Medicine that are within the health system, they would also have access to the electronic health record. But the large majority of pharmacies in the U.S. are not attached to a pharmacy or to a health system and don't have one. There's about 61,000 pharmacies in the U.S. Okay, so the prescription gets input. The information from the electronic prescription is transferred over into the dispensing software, at which time it gets adjudicated by the pharmacy. and basically we submit the claim to the insurer, and the insurer says, yep, we can pay for this drug. Then a technician is often the one filling. That might be hand counting, but there's also in large mail orders and in some busier pharmacies, it's automated. So there's robots that you send the information to the robot, and it spits out a labeled bottle that all you have to do is put a cap on. And then it goes to a pharmacist verification step. At which point the pharmacist makes sure that the information on the label of the prescription is accurate to what was prescribed, that the dose makes sense, that there's no drug-drug interactions with other medications. So every time we dispense medication, new or refill, it goes through a drug-drug interaction screen, and we make clinical decisions about whether or not that medication is appropriate for the patient and isn't going to adversely affect their well-being. And then, of course, we have patient pickup. And of course, this constrains the system to just inside the walls of the pharmacy. Once the patient takes that medication home, I have some pictures, if we have time, of what that can look like. And it ranges all the way from a very systematic, standardized, they follow the exact same process every day, to I've seen someone has just a box, they dumped all their pills into that box, and it's shaken up, and they have 10, 15 different medications freely sitting in this box, and she says, oh yeah, I just pick out the ones I need. They can change color, they can, she's not the best, can't see the best. So anyway, that's a whole nother area, when you could probably spend your entire career just studying what goes on in the patient's home. All right, so this is what maybe a typical pharmacy might look like. So up here we have, so this would be like the front counter. Patients come over here to pick up a prescription. This is where counseling would be. And then in the back, there's all the drug stock, and then the filling and the verification. So in general, this is the sort of the flow or the movement of the prescription through the pharmacy. It gets input over here, it gets filled, verified, and then it sits in the will call area waiting to be picked up. But what I did was we were doing observations in the pharmacy, tracking the pharmacist's movements, looking at how often they were getting interrupted and what they were doing when they were interrupted. And so I see this is what how the prescription flows through. This is a link analysis looking at the pharmacist's actual movements. And so we see both the nodes, which are the circles, and the links, which are the line. So the thicker the line, the more times the pharmacist traveled between those two spaces. And the bigger the node, the more times they were at that particular location. So you see they spend primarily a large majority of their time back here at the verification station. They move approximately a little over 20 times an hour, which is almost double that of what a nurse does on a hospital floor. So their work's very mobile and frequently interrupted, whether it's from telephone calls, patients arriving, technicians having questions. And so all of this can contribute to higher workload. So in the 2014 survey of pharmacists asked about the percentage or whether or not they reported negative or very negative effect of workload on these different dimensions. So we see physical health about a little over 35%. They have almost 50% say they don't have the opportunity to take an adequate break. Some pharmacists work 14-hour days and they don't get lunch breaks. Some of the ppharmacies they shut down for like a half hour midday to have a lunch break. They also say they have negative job satisfaction, job performance, and it's also correlated the longer they've been in the pharmacies, the more likely they are to report these types of symptoms. So this brings me to one of the models in job design to think about how do we design good, meaningful work that doesn't lead to burnout or stress or strain. And so this is the CareSet job strain model. Looks at both the decision latitude of a person in their work, and it can be either high or low, as well as the amount of demands, how much work they need to accomplish. And so high strain jobs are those that have very little decision over what they're doing and have a lot to do. Okay, and then the best kind of jobs are those that or the most fulfilling jobs are those that you have a lot of decision over what you're doing, as well as you have a lot to do. But you can choose how to go about it, and how to accomplish it, and so that can lead to motivation and engagement in new behaviors. But I would probably say Pharmacist, and again, it varies by organizational setting and the company. I would say maybe somewhere in this area, and then maybe it goes up and down depending. And so this is just one way to think about when we're analyzing a job, what are the factors that we should be thinking about in terms of long-term sustainability. So my primary interest is in, and more recently my interests are in the application of taking data, turning it into something that is meaningful, and using it to really inform decision making and improving performance. And so one of my professors at Wisconsin, he is big into this space of cognitive engineering and how do we analyze data to make sense of it. So one of the early thought leaders in the space is Don Norman. He wrote a really cool book called The Design of Everyday Things. If you haven't read it, it's a kind of a cool read on his interactions with in life, on good and bad design and what things sort of mean. And so within this space of of data science or data analytics, we have goals, right? So if we're up at this gulf of execution, we have goals of what we want to achieve, what we want to study, but we have limitations into the physical system, right? So we need to define what are we trying to do, what are we trying to answer, what are the data that are available to us in this system, and then we need to define how we're going to get there. What are the steps we take in order to get to that? And then once we've identified those steps, we carry it out, and then we need to represent that data in a way that's meaningful and helpful, right? If we can spend all this time doing this great analysis, but then if we bring it to a stakeholder and they don't know what it means, and we can't explain it to them, then all that work was a good exercise, but not going to drive changes. So really thinking about what those visualizations that you're producing look like is incredibly important to leading to meaning. And then we want to assess how well we're meeting those goals. So whenever I first get a new data set, it's usually pretty exciting. There's often a very big challenge to get access to some data. But the first thing we do is you think about the situation awareness of that data. So the first would be this first level of situation awareness being we're just sort of perceiving what's in there. We don't necessarily know what the data mean, but as we look at it more, we maybe do some quick plots, we start to develop a comprehension, or what is often referred to as the second level of situation awareness. Once we have comprehension, we can then manipulate that data in such a way, I'll talk about abstractions and aggregations, to then make projections about what the future states might look like, right? So we can use those to build predictive models. Those levels of situation awareness influence the decision, like what we do next. And then we assess our performance, and we often go back, right? So it's this very iterative process of analysis. It's rarely, unless you're doing very well-designed, controlled clinical trials, a lot of that information can't be defined up front because you really don't know what's in the data until you can get there. Okay, so now how do we actually create meaning from data? So this comes from Rasmussen, who's one of the original researchers in cognitive engineering. And he talks about these abstraction and aggregation hierarchies, right? So abstractions we can think of this in data as creating new variables, right? So if we have two columns of variables, if we take those columns, combine them in such a way to produce a new column, we could consider that an abstraction, right? We've changed the meaning of what the data are telling us. So easy example is we like to study error rates, right? In the data, we don't get an error rate, right? We don't measure error rates. We can infer error rates by taking the number of errors that are reported, and we may also have the number of medications that were dispensed in a period of time. And so what we can do, we can take the number of errors reported and divide it by the total number of medications dispensed, and now we get a rate of errors that occur in a pharmacy, right? So if we think about these two component parts, we move up the abstraction hierarchy to look at the data in a different way. And then aggregations are a little more simple, but are we interested in a patient and data about a patient? Are we interested about a health system? Are we interested about different providers and how providers may care for patients differently? And so the idea is that we want to move up and down the hierarchy and left and right to really find what is going to create the most meaning from the data. So Chuck Friedman has this, I don't know what he calls it, but the CBK, computable biomedical knowledge, keystone at the top. But basically we take data, we turn it into something that is useful or insightful. We use that knowledge to improve, to engage in performance improvement. And then based on our new performance data, we iterate through the cycle and we engage in what is called the learning health system, or this process of continuous learning from the data that are available to us. And I have a bit of an example of that in a little bit. Okay, so I want to talk about the prescription, some applications of some of the ways we analyze data. So the first is in the pharmacies, there's something called automatic prescription refills. So these are programs that were implemented about 10 years ago have you guys heard of them? Where they basically anticipate when you're going to run out of medication, and they refill the medication for you so that when you get to the pharmacy, it's already filled, you don't have to call it in. Sounds great, right? And in some ways it has a lot of benefits for the pharmacist workflow, which I'll talk about, but it also has implications potentially for medication adherence and measuring adherence. So if we think about when an automatic prescription refill was initiated compared to when a patient calls in the medication, my hypothesis was that we would be filling these automatic refills much sooner than a patient would normally call to order their medication and stop into the pharmacy. But it wasn't really doing anything directly to change the pickup habits of the patients, right? So if we look here at the bottom, you see auto refills. The median time in the pharmacy from the date that it was filled by the pharmacy to the date that it was picked up by the pharmacist was 7 days, compared to manual refills was 1 day. So what does that mean? And then if you look here at the bottom right you see 15% of all the auto refills were still in the pharmacy after 2 weeks, and just 5% of the manual refills were. And 35% of the manual refills were called in and picked up on the same day. So I think this has several implications. If we think about 1 week to fill a prescription, that gives us a lot of built-in wiggle room, right? Because we're able to say, okay, well, this medication, we've run our report, we have all these medications that need to be filled, and we can just say, okay, we'll get to those when we have time, when there's some free time, or, oh, there's a medication that we've run out of, we don't have that medication in stock, we need to order it. We don't have the patient who just came in 10 minutes ago saying, hey, I need my medication, I'm all out, right? But we do run into that very frequently in manual refills when they stop into the pharmacy. And it also has the potential to like smooth out the workflow, right? So if someone comes in, you have 20 prescriptions in your queue, someone comes in and they say, oh, I need this medication right now, I have 10 minutes. Basically you've thrown a wrench in like the normal workflow of the pharmacy, and not saying there aren't legitimate reasons, especially post-discharge when access to medication is really important. But as you'll see when I show some data on errors, that those walk-in prescriptions are more risky compared to other ways of calling in prescriptions. Okay, so what we do see is that automatic refills appear to improve patient adherence. Not much, but a little bit. However, when we run the way, so this is like another caveat or point, beware of how things are measured. Don't take things for face value. Investigate what are the component parts of the variables that are going into what is being said. So we use claims data to measure adherence at scale, right? We can look at when prescriptions were filled, how long they're supposed to last, and we can get an estimate of how long or how often you actually take your medication versus how many times you miss it. What you see here though is that if we look at adherence using the date it was filled versus adherence the date that it was picked up, we see in automatic refills, the difference between those is elongated. And in manual refills, it's squat. So there's very little difference between measured adherence between the refill and the pickup. But when we have these auto refills, which are sitting in the pharmacy for a lot longer, we appear, or it looks like patients are more adherent than they actually probably are. And this has implications because in CMS reimburses insurers based on how many patients, what the proportion of their patients that are adherent to the pharmacy, or that are adherent to certain medications. And so what you see here is these are stores in the data, and you can see the difference in the proportion of patients who were considered adherent. So like for example here, this is the proportion of patients adherent using the fill date, right? The date we billed the insurer. And then this is the proportion of patients adherent using the pickup date. And they have different star ratings, which I won't get into. I can have a long discussion about star ratings and measuring quality. But again, don't know what is going into the measures or metrics that we're using in healthcare. So quickly, I'll go through the patient experience. So I have done quite a bit of work using something called topic models, and these are a type of machine learning algorithm which look at the co-occurrence of words across many documents. So like for example, in Yelp, I pulled out all the reviews of community pharmacies in the US, in 8 cities in the US. And what the model does is it looks at the words associated with each topic. So if we specify, in this case, there's 3 topics, these words tend to occur together across all of the reviews. And we can use that information to label the topic or to make sense of what is the content or the topic content of that review. Like what is the person saying without actually going through and reading everyone by hand. And then we can also do, we can figure out what's the prevalence. So how much are they talking about a particular topic? And that's what this on the right-hand side is. So we get these two outputs. What is the information? And then how prevalent is it in our data? And so if we run this for, we ran a 10 topic model, and 9 of them I felt comfortable or able to label them. And what we see is based on the words and the reviews that score highly on a particular topic, we assign this human label to. So we see like friendly and helpful staff at 1-star Yelp reviews is almost non-existent, and at 5-star reviews it makes up almost 30% of the review content. We see waiting time. People talk about time, waiting long as in 1-star reviews, but very rarely do they talk about time in 5-star reviews. And so it doesn't replace like qualitative content analysis, but what it does do is it allows you to analyze data at scale, and it also lets you assign quantitative values to how much something is being discussed in a way that's much easier than qualitatively. And then I also plotted all the stores in the data for the greater Phoenix area, and I said, show me the stores that have the greatest prevalence of a particular topic. So friendly and helpful staff, those 5 blue dots are the locations of stores that perform, or most, where patients discuss friendly and helpful staff the most, and waiting time as well. All right, so let's talk about medication errors in particular, so that sort of better outcomes, how to achieve them. So I leaned on like Reason's Swiss cheese model, the SEEPS model, to build like a proposed framework for how errors happen and what happens when, what's like sort of the response, right? So prescriptions have inherent characteristics. They may have the way that they get called in or brought into the pharmacy. The pharmacies themselves have many prevention strategies built in that, you know, over the course of time have implemented, but things still slip through, right? So as the Swiss cheese model would say, ultimately there can still be errors, and so those contributing factors are the reasons those errors happen. And then the error can be either as a near miss, something that gets caught at a subsequent step, or it can be one that reaches the patient and potentially can cause severe, potentially deadly harm. When those errors happen, there's some sort of discovery process, right? So we have to detect that an error had happened, and like barcoding is a good example of a detection mechanism, but they're not really well described in the literature. So what I ended up doing was I ran, well, let's see. Yeah. So let me jump here. So this is an error reporting platform. So when a pharmacy staff member makes a mistake, they log into this system and they describe characteristics about the error that had happened. In particular, they write a note about what error had happened. And so what I did was there were over 500,000 error reports. I ran topic models on the notes to find out what was the information in that text. So before I get to those results, I'll just show you a little bit. So this is about 1,600 pharmacies in the US, and they all report to a central database. And I was fortunate enough to get access to this database to run, basically do a lot of exploratory analysis on it. So what we see here are the error rates. So the green line is the total number of the error rate. The blue line are the near misses, and then down below on the red line are the ones that reach the patient. So less than 1 in 1,000 errors actually reach the patient. Less than 1 in 1,000 prescriptions actually reach the patient, and even a smaller subset of those actually cause like severe debilitating harm, at least according to this data. The error rates do fluctuate anywhere depending upon how we define an error, from like 0.1 0.01% to all the way up to like 20%. So if we look at the different types of prescriptions, we see near miss prescription for walk-ins occurring at lower rates compared to those walk-ins that reach the patient. Sort of this like wrench in the system idea. There's this frantic rush to get the prescription out the door because the patient's like, why is it taking so long? Why is it taking so long? That sometimes errors slip through. We also see e-prescriptions, the green line, they're increasing over time. That's likely due to the volume of e-prescriptions being sent. But they're also more likely to be recorded as near misses. So, and this is consistent with other literature that shows that e-prescriptions are easy, those errors are easier to detect. The most risky would be the phone scripts. And the reason for that, anyone know? Why, or might guess or hypothesize why phone prescriptions would be more risky? Yeah, right, it's verbal. I'm listening to someone over the phone, I'm writing stuff down, the physician's trying to get off the phone, pharmacist, and so yeah, transcription error. And sometimes they're happening live, they're not always like recorded, so you can't even go back and listen. So like the speak back method is something that gets talked about a lot.
Well, what does E mean? E-I?
Oh, electronic. Yep. So of all the error types that were reported, almost 20% of those were other, right? We didn't classify it as an error. Or we didn't classify it as a particular type as defined on this in this drop-down menu. Skip that. And so what we see here, these are the topics found in the model which weren't found in the structured part of the data. So they were either like totally novel or they were more specific instances of what we could find from some structured data. So like for example, contributing factors renewing old to new RX. One of the common features in like the dispensing software is that patient has had this prescription before, you go into the computer, the profile, and you hit renew the old prescription, and then you attach the new prescription to it. The problem is that sometimes the directions change, the strength changes, and by renewing it, we've auto-populated all that old information into the new prescription, more likely to be missed. Patients also play an important role, like so these signals and detections, so the insurance rejects claims when they don't make sense. Pharmacists catch a lot of technician errors. Patients discover errors on their own. They often will call, hey, why does this tablet look different than what I had previously? A lot of times it's just a different manufacturer, but occasionally it is something wrong and the patient has to bring the medication back and exchange it. They also, pharmacists or pharmacy staff tend to blame themselves, right? And this is consistent in the literature. They say they're not paying attention when that error happened, or they forgot to read something carefully. But I would like to make the argument that really in some ways it's the design of the software or the system and the environment in which they're in, which is directly contributing to the reason that they quote unquote weren't paying attention or that they weren't reading carefully. So how can we support like pharmacist work? So this is moving more towards like where I currently am. And so think about human factors. The best kinds of interventions are those that are what we call forcing functions. We prevent things from happening. I have a good example, a very simple example of how we can overnight immediately change behavior in the electronic health record. Computerized automation, so removing pharmacy staff from some of those tasks that are, especially the redundant ones, the ones that we're doing over and over and over again, the ones we classify as skill-based behaviors, the ones and those are often a result of inattention or lapses in memory. And then redundancy, so a human does something, a computer is doing something alongside them, and when there's a mismatch, something gets flagged and we investigate it further. Decision support is good. but it can be overridden. It's prone to alert fatigue, especially when they're not sensitive. And then education and training. So those are the least reliable. Dr. Carrion over at Wisconsin, she'd always be like, we do not need to train and educate clinicians more. We need to think about these higher level functions. Okay, so some of the work that I'm doing right now is one is to look at the transcription of the drug order. So we've received the prescriber has directions for that prescription. It gets loaded into the dispensing software, but it often doesn't make sense, or it's confusing, or it needs to be manipulated or changed in some way. We do this all by hand. There's no computer. And so when we do this hundreds of times a day, as we saw in one of the previous slides, incorrect direction errors are some of the most common errors reported. So the idea is, and what we're doing now is we're annotating the directions of those prescriptions to say, here's the number of tablets they're supposed to take, this is the route, this is the frequency, and we can use natural language processing algorithms to identify those component parts, and we can compare what the technician did with what the prescriber sent over, and we can say, yeah, those are saying the same thing, or there's something different, and we flag it. The other thing is the indication for use. As I mentioned earlier in the beginning, that lack of indication is often it hampers some of the pharmacist's clinical work and our ability to go into drug databases to make sure that the dosing is appropriate. Antibiotics, especially, depending upon what infection we're treating, doses can look very different. We also see that with some mental health medications. So how do we start getting more indications on these prescriptions? We get these tablets. In some pharmacies, we image the tablets that go into the bottle. So potentially we can use computer vision algorithms to cross-reference between what's in the bottle and what we think should be in the bottle. And then the DUR, how do we support pharmacists in minimizing alert fatigue based on like more accurate patient-specific DURs or drug-drug interaction type. So if we look at indications, these are from Michigan Medicine. About 50% of the prescriptions here that were written for like as needed. So take 1 tablet by mouth as needed for sleep. Prior to this requirement in the health record being implemented, it was about 50%. And literally overnight, we can force that to 99.6, 99.7% of all prescriptions that are dispensed as needed. The problem is we have this issue with scheduled meds. So those that we take chronically without every day at the same time, very low, about 50%. We can add that same functionality to the indications. The concern is, what does that do to the provider? We force them to now an extra step, and potentially that adversely impacts their workload. Skip that in the interest of time. And then this is sort of like big picture, what might a future state of work look like? So this is how all pharmacy schools are training their pharmacists to engage in patient care. So we collect this relevant information, we take that information, assess it, we come up with a plan, implement that plan, and then we have monitoring parameters and we assess how well it's going. The problem is that this is very patient one-on-one work. Right, so a pharmacist does it in one clinic setting for one patient every single time. There's no learning between pharmacists, and there's difficult to learn between patients, right? So if you imagine this wheel being 1, 2, 3, 4, all these different patients, if we can somehow take all that information and analyze that at a population level, then we can think about the kinds of data that we're collecting, right? And we can start making better predictions about what that might look like. So if we think about this, I sort of just threw this together. We have our current patient, the pharmacist has drug therapy decisions to make. They rely on information that's stored in the computer using previous patient data or other patients based on some measure of similarity between what we're trying to do here and what we've done in the past for other patients in other health systems or with other providers. And then if we do it well, we can organize that information in such a way that the pharmacist knows what they're looking at, and then that can inform the patient outcome. So we can maybe think about what's someone's risk of having an adverse drug event based on all of these patient-specific characteristics, based on who's had adverse drug events that were similar to that patient in the past. We can predict response to treatment, and we can think about like likely health outcomes based on if we do drug A, patient, this is what we think your outcome will be. If we do drug B, this is what we think your outcome will be based on others like you. And that's very different than what we're doing now, which is high-level clinical guidelines, sort of one-on-one assessments. So yeah, I'd be happy to take any questions, and yeah.
So how would you measure adherence for something that doesn't get refilled?
That doesn't get refilled?
Yeah, whether it's like an antibiotic, you take that, I don't know, 5, 10, 15 days, whatever, but then it's not, like, you're not supposed to keep taking this.
Yep. So we have other ways that we might measure antibiotics. So there's some surveys. The problem, those can be difficult to scale, but there's some validated tools like 4-question surveys, like how much do you, trying to think what are the exact questions. Karen, you might be able to help me out here. But basically there are a set of questions that ask, like how likely they are to take the medication as prescribed. And we can get a sense for someone's projected adherence or adherence behaviors using like a survey or something. But yeah, claims data wouldn't work well for like antibiotics. Yeah, things without refills. We rely on the refills to help us assess someone's adherence over time. Yeah.
Well, you started out with saying that normal work per day is 14 hours. And the literature's full of it. And manufacturing, well, that's causes errors. Anything over 10 hours, the error rate goes up substantially. So right away, you mentioned that, and everybody knows. I mean, there's all kinds of data on that.
Yeah.
So why did it work with 14 hours?
Good question. I do know, like, not to like throw one pharmacy's name out there, Walgreens does restrict their hours to end. Walgreens, yeah, they have max 8-hour work days. But like CVS, they don't place restrictions on work hours. I mean, I agree. I think it should be an easy fix, right? But it also, it disrupts the person's life and the way they're used to being. But I mean, from personal experience, having worked 10, 12-hour days, by the end of the day, like your mind it's fried. And you rely heavily on the software to, like keep your attention in some cases, yeah.
You mentioned your ergonomics background. In the workplace itself, how much have you studied the quality of the workplace?
Oh, I think it's horrible.
Oh, okay.
I would love to study that too. I mean, we're on your feet all day. In very few cases have I ever gone into a pharmacy where you actually have a seat. People stand, and then like if you're really lucky, you get like one of those like nice padded mats. But oftentimes, like it's just like a crappy old mat that doesn't have any padding. Yeah, unfortunately, those are some of the realities of like the current pharmacists. Yeah.
Is there any work being done in terms of, you read at older pharmacists, there's all this institutional knowledge that they've acquired over the years. You have a great experience with them, and then they retire and you've got these new pharmacists in terms of using artificial intelligence and how you kind of infuse some of that wonderful experience and knowledge, and how does that get transferred? Any work in that space being done?
Yeah, I think sort of this idea of Jenna Weens over in computer science like recognizes the people that are building the AI algorithms are recognizing more and more that we need to rely on the domain knowledge and the domain expertise of the clinician, right? So there are, I don't want to say, we're getting there, and I think like a lot of like sitting down and like observing and asking questions about like think aloud protocols of like what are they doing, why are you doing that, like why did you decide to make this decision for a patient versus a different one. I think like there's a lot of potential on like leveraging that domain knowledge to inform the building of like AI algorithms. Like a good example would be like blood glucose. So like blood glucose levels, they sort of go like you eat, they go up, and they sort of like follow what maybe like a normal curve, right? So it would be, if we're trying to predict someone's blood glucose, it wouldn't make sense to train the algorithm to predict glucose in any other shape than sort of that general normal bell curve, right? So the person developing the algorithm may not necessarily know that we should constrain the algorithm's behavior based on that. Yeah.
Have you looked at like dosing errors that occur in a hospital, like intraoperatively? So like what would be pharmacy's role in kind of reducing errors that occur when drugs are being administered in the hospital?
So there's a lot of work that's been done. I have almost exclusively been on the outpatient side. There are, interesting, like, barcodes. We're like, oh, barcodes are going to solve all our problems. We're never going to have errors again. What we found out, though, is that, like, people just work around them, right? So, like, the classic example is the nurse goes in, they get the medications they need, they go to the bedside, and they give the medication, and then after they give the medication, they scan the patient, they scan the drug, right? So we're doing these things out of order. There are these workarounds, and they're not usually like, they're not intending to like do things unsafely, right? They, in a lot of ways, they're just trying to get their job done, and again, the environment in which they're in may not have lent itself to using the scanner at the time in the order in which they were supposed to. Yeah. I can send you some. There's a really cool one showing like the 100 different ways of nurses administer medication. Not the number of 100 different ways in which the steps to administer medication could be done. Yeah. Yeah.
So when you did the natural language processing, did you ever compare that to any of actual to see if customers agree with actual qualities of error rate and stuff? Those like matched up?
In the Yelp data?
Yeah, so you saw like the customers were actually correctly identifying pharmacies with higher levels of quality rather than just customer service.
So I didn't. There was no way to like combine the data into like a relational database. So yeah, I just had what the patient said. So yeah, it's a very valid point. What someone says was an unsafe pharmacy or a bad experience may turn out that they have like the best adherence rates and that they catch all their drug
Because like Yelp reviews, some people can leave them really negative or really positive. I don't miss out.
Yeah,
How do you want like?
So that I should caveat that data they're totally biased, right? Because they're self-reported, but at the same time they're also a sample of it was like 4,500 reviews and about 1,000 pharmacies, which again, like not necessarily easy to collect that much data. And so while it's not perfect, it does provide like some indication or some future study. And surprisingly, like the things that people said, well, maybe not too surprisingly, so like waiting time or friendly staff, like friendly staff gets 5-star reviews, waiting times get 1-star reviews. I mean, that sort of like intuitively makes sense.
So it's just hard to measure, because like waiting times, you know, do they get there, sit there and wait while they're pharmacy? Like, do they go in and give them the thing and they wait for them to fill it, or do they do it in advance so that they have no waiting time? Like, with the needs to like visualize, like, or like the difference between a 4-star and 3-star, there's different people. Like, we can just be like a plateau really good because their service times are the same, just how people wait it. So,
Yeah.
data, but
The one last point I would make about that is, right, so if you organize those reviews, and you say, show me the reviews that talk about waiting time the most, a lot of times once you do that, when you read them, you realize that it's often this like missed expectations. They said it was gonna be 10 minutes, it was 20. That's when and they described that case versus just saying like, oh, they told me it was gonna be an hour and it took 45 minutes. I'm like, that doesn't come up nearly as much as this mismatch between expectations.
Kind of going off of this question, did you look into analyzing other feedback from like other feedback sources outside of Yale?
Like what?
I don't know if there's like a place at the pharmacy where you can like read comments and feedback.
So, I mean, there are
Is
certainly
there like other data though?
not for those particular stores. Certainly, if like I was CVS and I had, I mean, a good number of those stores in that data are CVS or Walgreens, then like I could take that data and like match it back to those stores. But as like an independent researcher, I don't have that capability. There are lots of there's a lot of survey work that's looked at patient experience, patient satisfaction, and we see those similar types of domains or topics.
So why don't we go ahead and thank our speaker, and then if you can leave our 15 minutes.